Jane Austen is known for focusing on the choices, thoughts, and feelings of her Regency-era female characters, drawing out the universal and timeless ideas that those thoughts and conflicts involve. In 2020, there was a new movie adaptation of Emma, and that version will probably be the younger generation's introduction to Jane Austen's works. But how well does this adaptation depict the conflicts and values of the original? Let's compare the 2020 film adaptation of Emma starring Anya Taylor-Joy to the novel. First, a brief summary of the story in case you haven't read it or haven't seen it or haven't read it in a while. After her governess Miss Taylor gets married, the wealthy 21-year-old Emma Woodhouse sets out to befriend and improve a young woman named Harriet Smith. She attempts to find Harriet a suitable husband in Mr. Elton, the parish priest. But that plan backfires spectacularly. Meanwhile, her former governess's new son-in-law comes to town and starts to flirt with her, throwing all of her relationships into a new light. Emotions and relationships form and shift through balls, Christmas parties, picnics, and more dramatic events like attacks by gypsies. All the while, Emma and Harriet are both trying to do what's right by others, as well as to find their own happiness in the end. What I think is most appealing, relatable, and valuable about the original story is Emma's character arc. She has a very strong one, even though it's a little bit less dramatic than I think some of the character arcs we're used to reading about today. A character arc is a character's change or internal journey that they go through throughout the course of a story. Usually it's a positive character arc, but you can have a negative character arc as well. She starts out very presumptive. She feels like she has some sort of entitlements because of her social class at that time. She's a gentleman's daughter and the heir to a large estate. She's very willing to meddle in her friends' affairs. She's kind of snobby, and she's really blind to certain facts that don't fit her narrative and goals. But by the end of the novel, through a combination of learning from her failures, really sincerely wanting to do right by her friends, and be deserving of her love interest, Mr. Knightley, all these things together enable her to learn to let her friends make their own decisions, to look more clearly at the evidence and not to assume so much. And these flaws of character, although they make Emma a little bit unlikable, I think are very relatable. They are things that a lot of us have done at least a few times in our lives, especially when we were younger, but as a result of the lessons that she learns, she explicitly determines to be a better person, and ends up making a new friend as a result. And though this arc is present in the movie, it's not as obvious and explicit as it is in the book. This comes through in a few ways, perhaps most obviously through Mr. Knightley, this old family friend who Emma eventually falls in love with. Mr. Knightley criticized Emma quite a lot in the book, and although he does still criticize her somewhat in the movie, it's a lot less. Austen sums it up this way near the beginning of the book. She says, quote, "Mr. Knightley, in fact, is one of the few people who could see faults in Emma Woodhouse, and the only one who ever told her of them." End quote. One of the key aspects of Emma's character arc is her matchmaking, her trying to help her friends find love and happiness. This is well-intentioned, but she eventually learns usually not a very good idea. But it starts out with her former governess, Miss Taylor, marrying Mr. Weston, and Emma is very pleased about this match, not only because she thinks it'll be good for both of them, but because she helped to bring it about. Mr. Knightley tells Emma that she didn't really do anything to bring about the marriage, and kind of lessens her efforts in that effect, probably in an effort to get her not to try to do it again. But in the movie, we don't see any sort of conversation like that. Now, as I mentioned, Emma wants her new friend Harriet Smith to marry the parish priest Mr. Elton. Harriet, however, was already in love with a farmer named Mr. Martin, who is a friend of Mr. Knightley's. Mr. Martin proposes marriage to Harriet, and Emma encourages her to turn him down. Knightley is very upset about this, and the two argue, and although this argument appears in both the book and the movie, it's much shorter in the movie. Of course, with adaptations, things often are shorter, but he doesn't go as far as in criticizing her, which is a more significant point. In the book, he says that Harriet, quote, "had no sense of superiority before. If she has it now, you have given it. You have been no friend to Harriet Smith, Emma," end quote. And that's quite a harsh thing to say. He really doesn't say anything as harsh or as serious about Emma generally, or about Emma's friendship with Harriet in the movie. Similarly, in the book, he calls Emma a nonsensical girl. Now, he's somewhat playing, but he doesn't make any comparable comments in the movie. And then there's a whole scene that's omitted from the movie involving Frank Churchill, which is Miss Taylor's son-in-law. He and Emma sort of have an inside joke at a larger gathering, and Mr. Knightley tells Emma off for this joke. Because laughing about an inside joke in front of others, of course, makes everyone else feel left out. And we see the resonant effects in Emma that Mr. Knightley's criticism has encouraged her to want to improve herself. And she takes it very seriously. Part of her character arc is actually trying to improve her character, trying to improve herself morally. One example of this is in relation to Emma playing the piano. At that time, the aristocracy, wealthy ladies, were expected to have certain accomplishments. They were expected to play an instrument, to draw, to sew, that kind of thing. And Emma, although she's very intelligent, doesn't really have the patience to work at things, to put in the practice that you need to really become a master of an instrument. And for this reason, she somewhat resents Jane Fairfax, who's a young woman about her age, who's poor but somewhat still aristocratic, who's incredibly good at the piano. And we get this scene in which Jane Fairfax, and who doesn't live in the same village but has come to visit, Jane Fairfax is invited to this party. Emma plays the piano and everyone, very politely applauds her, and then Jane goes up to play and she's amazing. She blows everyone away. And so we can see that Emma is kind of shown up by Jane. And Mr. Knightley makes a comment to the effect of, oh, perhaps you don't like Jane Fairfax because she is the accomplished young woman you wish yourself thought to be. And we know that Emma is aware of this difference between herself and Jane. What we do get in the book is the next day Emma practices the piano for an hour and a half in order to improve. She's only stopped by Harriet coming in and telling her how wonderful she is. And Emma telling Harriet, no, I'm not bad at the piano, but Jane is much better. And really giving Jane her due and trying to improve herself in order to equal Jane, rather than just letting it sit at that level of resentment. We also see in the book a lot of Emma wanting to be worthy of Mr. Knightley. She really takes his criticism seriously, even when she appears to brush it off. She thinks about it, and she often changes her behavior accordingly. Once, after she's tried to help Jane Fairfax with some things, she reflects that, quote, she had the consolation of knowing that her intentions were good, and of being able to say to herself that could Mr. Knightley have been privy to all her attempts of assisting Jane Fairfax, could he even have seen into her heart, he would not on this occasion have found anything to reprove, end quote. We don't really get any sense of this in the movie, of Emma wanting to be worthy of Mr. Knightley. It's very much a more straightforward or sort of surface level falling in love between the two of them. So although we do see Emma learning the error of her ways in terms of matchmaking, and in terms of being a little bit cruel to Miss Bates, we don't see this overarching sense of Emma wanting to improve herself to be worthy of Mr. Knightley, and in part because of Mr. Knightley's criticisms. There are two other elements that are related to this I want to bring up briefly. One is how Emma handles Mr. Knightley's confession of being in love with her at the end. In the book, Emma makes a big deal about not bringing up Harriet when Mr. Knightley confesses that he's in love with her. In that climactic scene at the end, when Mr. Knightley tells Emma that he's in love with her, Emma makes it a point not to bring up Harriet, who is also in love with Mr. Knightley, or thinks she is. Emma does this for two reasons. One, she has realized that she really is genuinely in love with Mr. Knightley. She has finally realized what's best for her, and she stopped blinding herself to things that are inconvenient, and so she actually does want the relationship between the two of them to work out. But she's also trying to protect Harriet. She wants Harriet's unrequited love to remain a secret, and she wants to protect her from the embarrassment of knowing that her love is not returned. But in the movie, she brings up Harriet pretty much right away. When Mr. Knightley says, "Will you marry me?" she replies, "I cannot, Harriet. She's in love with you, and believes that you may love her too, and you danced with her and showed her kindness," and she goes on and breaks out in sobs, and it's very dramatic. So she brings up Harriet right away, and the fact that she tells Mr. Knightley right away that Harriet is in love with her doesn't show the same concern for her friend's feelings and the same resolve to really handle situations in a more mature and better way. One final point that is in the book that is omitted from the movie that I think is pretty important as a resolution to Emma's character arc is her relationship with Jane Fairfax. We see the resentment earlier, like in the scene with the piano. We see that Emma doesn't really like Jane Fairfax, even though there's no good reason for that. Jane's never done anything wrong to her. But in the book, the two untangle some misunderstandings, and at the very end of the book, they start to form a friendship, a genuine, warm friendship. And we don't see that in the movie, which I think is really significant, because her friendship with Jane is sort of one of the rewards of Emma's improvement. You see Emma drifting away from Harriet in both the book and the movie, but we don't see in the movie her getting to be friends with Jane. Jane, by all accounts, is a very nice young woman, if a bit on the shy, reserved side. She's genuinely very sweet, very well-meaning. Having such friends is the kind of reward that we generally are able to enjoy. If we are good people, we get to have good friends who share our values. One other difference between the book and the movie, which has nothing to do with Emma's character arc, but which I think does undermine some of the other characters, relates to Mr. John Knightley. So this is the main Mr. Knightley's brother, and John Knightley is married to Emma's sister, Isabella. In the book, we occasionally see John Knightley having moments of impatience, but he always regrets them, he feels bad about them, and he tries to be extra nice afterward to make up for it. In the movie, we only see John Knightley and Isabella a couple of times in a couple of scenes, but in each case, John is way more impatient with Isabella, and Isabella is way more annoyed with John. At Emma's wedding, at the very end when her husband tears up and Isabella looks kind of angry at him, I think that was really meant to be humorous, but the result is that it undercuts Isabella's character. Isabella is sort of a traditional wife and mother, and she loves it. She's described in the book as, quote, "a pretty, elegant little woman of gentle, quiet manners and a disposition remarkably amiable and affectionate, wrapped up in her family, a devoted wife, a doting mother." And when she visits Hartfield, Austen comments that, quote, there could hardly be a happier creature in the world than her. Another example is when they arrive at Hartfield to visit Emma and Mr. Woodhouse, and John is complaining the whole way. You hear his voice, he's been complaining about the children's milk spilling on his trousers, and he gets out and declares that was unendurable. That's a rather harsh thing to say. For just a carriage ride. I mean, we've all been on long road trips, okay? There are little annoyances, we get it. But he's really much more unpleasant to his wife. And as a result, Isabella is much less happy in the movie than she is in the book, and I think that just undercuts her character. Visually, I think it's stunning. The stylization, the different color themes for the different seasons, it just really looks fantastic. A lot of the actors do a really good job. Anya-Taylor Joy and Bill Nighy as Emma Woodhouse and her father, Mr. Woodhouse, do bring a lot of vibrancy and warmth to their roles. This adaptation also emphasizes the benevolent humor that is present in a lot of Austen's works, and certainly in Emma as well. Perhaps it goes a little bit too far when Emma gets a nosebleed during the climactic scene when Mr. Knightley proposes. I felt that was not very helpful or necessary. But most of the rest of the time, the humor that's added or emphasized really does make it just a more fun and positive experience. And two characters I thought we saw that in especially were Mr. Woodhouse and the parish priest, Mr. Elton. In the book, Mr. Woodhouse is Emma's father, is very much a hypochondriac. He's very worried about everyone's health, and this is probably because he lost his wife prematurely when she was relatively young. But he's super good friends with the doctor, and he's overworried about drafts, about people going out. He's just very, very cautious. But he loves his children. He also detests change, so he thinks that he ought to pity Miss Taylor when she gets married and becomes Mrs. Weston because she's getting married and she's moving to a smaller house. And the first time we see Mr. Woodhouse in the movie, he hops down the stairs and yells out, "Poor Miss Taylor!" And the line, "Poor Miss Taylor," and the pitying of Miss Taylor is totally in line with his character in the book, but the way he comes down and just hops down the stairs and cries this out is just a little bit more entertaining. It does show him being a little bit more active and not so elderly and frail as he is in the book, but I think it's in the service of humor, and it does a nice job. In the movie, Mr. Woodhouse is also a little bit smarter, a little bit more with it, and near the end we get a scene where he pretends to feel a draft so that he can encourage Mr. Knightley and Emma to sit on the same couch and give them a little bit of privacy. The movie version preserves the key aspects of Mr. Woodhouse's character. He's very much a hypochondriac, he's very much overcautious, and he's very much a doting and loving father who doesn't like change and doesn't like people getting married and that sort of thing. But he's a bit brighter, he's a little bit more with it, he's a little bit more active and a lot of fun. Mr. Elton, the parish priest, is somebody who's a social climber, who thinks very well of himself, and in this movie adaptation, he's way over the top pompous, with so many of his facial expressions and hand gestures, and it just makes him very, very funny to watch. One particular instance where you really see this, Mr. Elton had been asked to go and get a frame for a drawing that Emma had done of Harriet, which he was delighted to do. He went and bought the frame, and we have this very dramatic unveiling of it in the movie where he's like acting essentially like he's a magician pulling a rabbit out of a hat. So he adds a nice bit of humor as well. And that is definitely in keeping with his character as being the sort of snobby, pompous guy. So to wrap up, I think the adaptation has strengths and weaknesses. It's visually stunning, it adds a nice bit of humor, but it does soften a little bit of Emma's character arc, which I think is its most significant weakness. It's really important that we all want to improve ourselves, and characters who show us how to do that in ways that are relatable, ways that we can learn from, are really wonderfully valuable characters. And I think it's a credit to Jane Austen's work that so many of her characters fit that description. And it's one of the reasons that I love Emma so much.